this podcast is made possible by the generosity of listeners like you. Kindly consider a contribution through Patreon or PayPal. Links are in the details box. Patreon is a monthly subscription that you can cancel anytime, and PayPal is a one-time donation. Any amount is appreciated. And follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, the handle, the Beirut Banyan. And you can find us on our YouTube channel with the same name, and you can start watching the episodes as they're released. Thank you for listening, and thank you for watching. I'm Ronnie Shatah, and this is the Beirut Banyan. First of all, I should say thank you for willing to stay up until midnight to record with me. That's flattering. Not many people would be willing to stay that late regardless. I know that you probably prefer being asleep, but for better or worse, you're with me right now. That's the first thing. Second thing, willing to speak to me at a time of global pandemic. I'm assuming you still have better things to do than talk to me. Equally flattering that you're willing to talk to me while the world is mostly shut down, and that you're willing to engage a topic that I don't know enough about, and I know that you have explored heavily. It's new terrain for me. So for all of the reasons and more, it's really a privilege to speak to you again, Eric. We do run into each other from time to time on the streets of Beirut. I think we've run into each other in New York once or twice in the past.
Yep.
We're probably better at eating at Sherbel's, Le Chef, and Gemese and playing chess than we are doing something more formal. But let's try to upgrade the friendship to a professional.
Le Chef and the Beirut cafes are our natural habitat.
Too many times have I seen you crossing the street with your sunglasses on, shorts, sandals in the summer heat, going from cafe to cafe. On a Monday,
yeah,
and I'm probably doing the same thing.
That was the routine when getting out of the house was a possibility, and I was still in Beirut.
And it speaks to the moment that even if we were in Beirut, even if we were here in New York together, the chances are we wouldn't be doing it in person. That we'd still be resorting to this way of communication.
Yeah.
Before anything, I didn't know that you have a series of articles, and if I may, they're more than articles, they're essay-like stories on the despair, the struggle, the whole world of migration. There's at least 15, 20 sort of articles that explore the whole terrain. I'm going to link these to the episode. And I like that you've updated it to the point that coronavirus is now part of the story as well. I'm just going to start off from there, and then we can kind of go backwards, and we'll explore more things as well, not just migration. But in your mind, the authoritarian trend that seems to take hold in times of crisis, there's a border-like sensitivity. People are looking inwards to a point. Nationalism, the way we understand it, that there's a reluctance to really pay attention to the ongoing suffering, whether it's people in the sea drowning, whether it's people sort of fleeing a war zone and trying to make their way through Turkey into Europe, or even not too long ago, these very, very difficult attempts from Lebanon. And you talk about this as well, these sort of boats fleeing from the north, trying to get to Cyprus. Does the coronavirus, does COVID-19 play a role in making it all the more difficult, more challenging for, let's say, Europeans that want to help, and for those that are suffering, making their way into Europe, hoping that there is help on the way?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a good place to start when thinking about this is it's sort of a weird moment to think about mobility and people continuing to cross borders around the world, because so many of us are being told to stay in our houses, not leave our cities, really trying to limit how much we're moving. But I think one of the most interesting things that I've heard, and probably one of the most important things that I've heard in the reporting that I've been doing on migration during the coronavirus pandemic, is that the factors that cause people to flee from where they are haven't been put on hold because
Right.
of the pandemic. So if you're a Syrian in Idlib, and the Russian / regime bombing campaign is continuing, you have just as much of an incentive to get out of there as you would have had before coronavirus.
Right.
If you're an Eritrean in a detention center in Libya, where systematic abuse takes place, where there's a civil war taking place, if you're able to get out of that situation and get on a boat to try to make it to Europe, you're absolutely going to want to try to do that. So I think there's a little bit of like a incongruousness happening where, I'm sitting here saying, everyone's telling me to stay put. The thing that I have to do in order to control this situation is to stay where I am. Yet there are people in the world who are continuing to cross borders and do it irregularly.
Right.
So I think, there could be, a way of looking at it as, well, if everybody else is being told to stay put, why shouldn't asylum seekers, refugees, migrants also have to stay put?
Yeah.
But I think it's really, really important to keep in mind that the, underlying factors that are causing those displacements and those migrations haven't changed. So COVID-19 can be a factor that makes people's situations more precarious, but it's not a factor that makes it safer to stay somewhere.
Right. There's no encouragement to stay home when you can't stay home.
Yeah.
But is there, I mean, I kind of understood from, at least I think it's the most recent piece you wrote, may have been 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, how COVID-19 halted NGO migrant rescues in the Mediterranean. A lot of things that are explored in these articles, and I want to emphasize, these are not just standard articles. This is like a proper story in an essay, and they're a pleasure to read. That the sincere attempt of a rescue worker is stunted because of coronavirus. Is there anything on the other side, meaning that the Europeans that are trying to help are reluctant because of coronavirus?
Yeah. So I would say the second important thing that I've, in terms of sort of contextualizing the work around migration, or my reporting around migration during the coronavirus pandemic, is that there's been a trend towards limiting mobility and making it more difficult for people to, cross borders to reach somewhere where they can apply for asylum for a number of years now.
Yeah.
So what we're seeing under coronavirus is sort of an acceleration of that trend, or an extension of that trend in a lot of ways. And there are, there are instances where governments are putting in place policies that limit access to asylum and limit mobility that have nothing to do, that can't be justified by
with COVID
public health concerns.
Right.
And then there are instances where, so the search and rescue example that you brought up is an instance where, the people who are working on these NGO boats in the Mediterranean, who are sort of filling this gap because European countries have withdrawn from doing proactive search and rescue activities in the Mediterranean. They're European citizens who are subject to the same sort of travel restrictions and stay-at-home orders that many of us are subject to. So, if you're a German who wants to go volunteer on one of these boats, now you can't do that because you can't get to the place where the boat is leaving from.
Right, exactly.
So that's one of the factors. It's sort of, that's not a malevolent sort of attempt to limit the ability to people for people to help asylum seekers and migrants. That's just sort of, the coronavirus putting in place, the response to the coronavirus putting in place an obstacle that is equally applied to everybody.
Right.
On the other side of the equation, you have, things like Hungary canceling its asylum process,
right,
and using coronavirus as a justification for that. Where Hungary has been putting in place policies for years now looking to limit access to asylum. So it's a very clear example of how the government in Hungary is leveraging the virus to put in place a policy that doesn't really have anything to do with, public health or public safety.
Right.
And using that to restrict people's ability to find safety.
I'm impressed that you're eloquent even after midnight. So you know what? I should do this regularly with you. If this is your magic at midnight, yeah. I wonder what you're like at 5 p.m.
I might be less articulate at 5 p.m.
All right. So that's
that's nap time, Ronnie.
Of course, I always forget it's siesta time. But it's in my limited knowledge on the subject, and I want to sort of take it from coronavirus into the wider political sort of background story here. Would you argue that this issue is still the biggest concern, at least when it comes to the consequences of conflict in the Middle East? Meaning that whether it's Hungary's reaction, or even when it's the Turkish-Greek border, or for that matter, maybe the hysteria in the UK that we saw prior to Brexit, that kind of advertisement of floods of Syrian refugees marching their way into Europe. Is this still a central issue, or has it kind of taken a back seat, that now people are less engaged with the subject, and the fact that the numbers did decline enough where people are not seeing it as a pressing concern any longer?
I think that it is still an animating issue, especially in terms of European politics. You're right that the numbers have declined significantly for the central Mediterranean between North Africa and Italy. There's always been a degree of irregular migration. I guess that's another important point. People tended to tune in 2014, 2015, somewhere around that time period, right? Mm-hmm. But historically, there's always been a degree of movement between North Africa and Italy, and also between Turkey and Greece. So this is not some historically unprecedented thing that has happened. It's just for a handful of years, there were numbers that hadn't been seen before.
So even prior to Libya and the Libyan war, that this was always an ongoing issue.
Yeah.
Okay.
You'll actually appreciate this. I think Gaddafi was very shrewd in his understanding of European politics, and he actually used the irregular migration issue as a pressure tool to extract concessions from Europe. And just prior to when the EU announced that it would be participating in the support of the opposition in Libya, yes. Gaddafi made a speech saying that he was going to, I might not get the quote directly correct, but a paraphrase of what he said was he was going to launch refugee boats at Europe like missiles.
So this was a weapon that he was using, and this is what, going back to, I'm guessing, way before any of the Arab Spring issues began, that this is a long-standing weapon.
Going back at least to the mid-90s.
Right.
And he actually made a deal with Italy at some point where he would control migration in return for economic support, in return for training of the Libyan Coast Guard, that sort of stuff.
Is any of this repeating itself, where the Europeans are looking at autocrats to kind of deal with this issue?
Absolutely. I mean, Turkey is a good example of that. 2015 was the big year for migration between Turkey and Greece. That's the year where, between the beginning of 2015 and the beginning of 2016, more than 1 million people crossed from Turkey into Greece, and then most of them made their way onward to Northern Europe. Mm-hmm. And the thing that's credited with bringing that surge in migration to an end was the EU-Turkey deal, which was signed between the EU and Turkey. It's an informal agreement,
right?
More of an understanding than like a treaty or a legally binding thing. But basically, it was saying that the Turkish government under Erdogan would control Turkey's borders in exchange for financial support from the EU
Right.
to,
Right.
a lot of the financial support went to, care for Syrian refugees who were in Turkey, because Turkey hosts the largest Syrian refugee population.
Right. And this is your own sort of personal take. I'm curious. The let's say beyond the responsibility, let's say the solution, is it still lie in solving conflicts in the Middle East first? And I'm going to just pick your brain here that had the Syrian war not sort of taken a very deadly turn where Syrians were forced to flee their homes en masse, millions ending up in Lebanon alone, and of course in Turkey and Jordan, and then many making their way into Europe, that is still the primary concern at preventing conflict to that degree? Or is that something that's beyond the scope of the sort of debate, that this is a sort of, you should be able to deal with the consequences regardless, that you should be able to handle that kind of human movement?
Yeah, I think, it depends on what perspective you approach it from. I think from the perspective of the EU, there's a lot of talk about addressing the root causes of migration, whether that be conflicts in places like Syria or the Middle East, or poverty and economic issues in places like West Africa. So there's been a lot of, particularly to address, the sort of social root causes. There's been a lot of funding put into that from the EU. Less attention put towards trying to do anything sort of concrete on Syria. But what the EU has also done is, if people flee from a place like Syria, they've invested a lot of money in trying to, quote unquote, improve the conditions in first countries of asylum, so the first places that people reach after they flee, so that there might not be so much of an incentive to leave a second time and try to make it to Europe.
Right.
The other
but there's
side of
nothing concrete when it comes to Syria. That was kind of off. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what I mean. Yeah. Over the course of the war in Syria, both European countries and the U.S., especially after a certain point, checked out a bit in terms of taking very strong proactive actions to, shape the outcome of the conflict somehow. So I guess that's what I meant by that part of it. Looking at it from like a human rights and international legal standpoint, it's a little bit different because the International Refugee Convention and international law around these issues was developed in the wake of World War II, where you had a massive refugee crisis. And so, their international law and EU law is, very explicit that it doesn't matter how many people are fleeing, you have a legal obligation to listen to people's claims to asylum on an individual basis. And if people have, a legitimate fear for their lives, fear for political persecution, then they need to be granted asylum. So in that sense, it's not so much about how many people are coming, why are they coming? It's about countries who have built systems that are based on a particular set of values, respecting and living up to those values.
Did I understand it right that there's, and I got this from several articles, that there is a maritime law issue as well, that you are obligated to help those in stress in the sea, that's not a political debate, that's in a sense that's a requirement.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a legal requirement in maritime law that if a ship, and this doesn't just go for like a refugee ship or a boat carrying asylum seekers and migrants. This goes for for any vessel at sea. But if there's a ship in distress at sea, then there's a legal obligation to attempt to rescue the people on that ship. And it's every country is supposed to have a maritime rescue coordination center, and there are parts of the sea that extend from their territorial waters that they have responsibility over, and if a ship is in distress in that water, then they're responsible for contacting the closest vessel to that ship and making sure a rescue attempt takes place.
The reason I ask is that I did not know this, that there is a rescue ship, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, I don't remember the origins, but it's named after the Alan Kurdi incident, the tragic death of the Syrian boy drowned on the coast. I don't remember the country that it was. I hope I got this. Was it Ireland?
The flag state of the Alan Kurdi is Germany.
Germany, sorry, right, and that they are picking up where states are not. That they are kind of proactively trying, and with all the difficulties of whether it's COVID-19 or any difficulty, that they're in a way fulfilling the role of a state's responsibility. That they're the ones. And you pointed at certain countries that kind of now avoid migrant paths. They look at Libya, for example, and they kind of pick an area that they know no one is heading towards. It's almost like proactively avoiding it.
Yeah, and I think it's also interesting to look, because you asked about the politics around it earlier, like how important is this issue politically still? I was saying that in terms of actual numbers, the numbers are not, between 2013 and 2017, the numbers were, several times higher than they had ever been in the past.
Yes.
But now the numbers, they were starting to creep up a little bit last year, but they're not historically unprecedented numbers at this point. They're well within the range of, where things were prior to 2011.
I see. So it's like familiar territory.
Yeah, it should be. But the migration issue has become such a hot button political issue. You mentioned it being one of the scare tactics that was evoked during the Brexit campaign.
Yeah.
It's become such a salient political issue that even if the numbers are small, people have an awareness of it now to an extent, and particularly sort of right-wing populist parties have understanding of how to exploit anxieties around it in a way that really drives the conversation around it and also drives the policy around it. And so this issue of why are NGOs doing this search and rescue work to begin with is a good illustration of it, because in 2013, at the beginning of October, there was a shipwreck off the coast of Lampedusa, which is the southernmost Italian island. It's the closest point in Europe to North Africa. And I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but several hundred people drowned within sight of the coast of the island of Lampedusa.
Yes.
And over the next couple of days, the bodies were brought ashore or washed ashore, and they were put in coffins, and the survivors came on shore and they told their stories, and there were pictures in the media of, hangars full of coffins, stretching on. And it was this moment that really, it evoked a powerful sort of humanitarian sentiment from the general public in Italy at the time, the general public in Europe, and also the Italian government. And so after that, Italy put together a proactive maritime search and rescue mission with its Navy and its Coast Guard called Mare Nostrum, where between the end of October 2013 and around the same time 2014, the Italian Navy said any boat that is in distress in the waters between Italy and Libya, we're responsible for saving. And we're doing this as a humanitarian action by the state.
Right.
That was 2014.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You fast forward 6 years, and now you have what you were referring to. The EU at the beginning of April launched a new maritime mission that's mandate is to enforce the arms blockade on Libya.
Right.
And the issue of, so the whole debate is, does the presence of ships rescuing people at sea create a pull factor that incentivizes people to come to Europe?
And I'm going to interrupt you. Sorry. I like that you also emphasize the point that there's been no evidence to show that.
Yeah. So the statistical research on it doesn't show the presence of rescue boats being a decisive factor in any way.
Right.
But the issue of, maritime search and rescue almost prevented this arms embargo maritime mission from actually taking shape. And then once it did take shape, it took shape with compromises, where now the operational plan of the mission has the boats from the mission stationed in an area off the coast of Libya where, refugee and migrant departures usually don't take place, so that the boats are far away from where people are going out to sea. So it's less likely they will, end up having to rescue people and bring them to Europe.
So in a way that's proof, I guess, that the politics still matter, that there are political calculations that are still being made based on sort of that fear mongering. Yeah,
the politics matter tremendously in the context of the EU, for sure.
Right. Eric, there's an article you released about these sort of very, very dangerous attempts in northern Lebanon, these boats sort of trying to make their way to Cyprus, and that even though the numbers were not that big, still the fact that this was happening, this was a new kind of attempt at Syrian refugees fleeing Lebanon. The article is Unsafe in Syria, Unwanted in Lebanon. And I ask you this because as somebody who's, maybe automatically I lean more towards the Lebanese pieces out of pure prejudice, maybe, I don't know. But I kind of was reading through that article carefully. This is a story I had no idea about, never heard of. It's almost like uncovering something for the first time. And did anyone else report on this issue? Because I looked thoroughly online and I couldn't find any other material on those ships. Not ships, sorry. These like very sort of rickety boats that were, and people were dying as a result. Was there large coverage there? Because I really couldn't find any other material.
Yeah, there wasn't a lot of coverage. I remember at the time seeing a couple of stories, and there were maybe one or two stories that came after the one that I did also, but it never became a big news item.
Yeah.
And I think there's multiple reasons why potentially. One was, I think that authorities in Lebanon were sort of trying to keep a lid on it because they didn't want people to think of it as, oh, this is an option. Like, this is something we can try to do, because there's probably plenty of people in Lebanon who would want to leave.
Yeah.
If there was a way to do so. So I think the army in the north was in particular, sort of keeping things quiet a bit.
But the reason sorry, go ahead.
And the other thing is that the army in the north did a very good job also policing the maritime border in Lebanon. So not too many of these boats were able to go.
Right.
If it was an open route, I think you would have seen a lot more of it happening.
Right, that makes sense. And you also pointed out that just the fact that the coast is not that long to begin with, and it's a heavily populated coast, that it's easy to catch that kind of activity, or it's difficult to kind of avoid scrutiny that way. But the reason I'm asking you is because that is investigative journalism. And go ahead.
I'm laughing because I think you'll enjoy the backstory of how I ended up writing that article, which might take the mask off of investigative journalism a little bit.
You were trying to get to Cyprus?
Yeah, I was looking for a way myself. No, that story actually fell into my lap, and it, So what happened was I was living in Beirut at the time, And one day I got a WhatsApp message out of the blue from somebody whose name on WhatsApp was Abu al-Shahid.
Okay.
And, and he was writing to me in, basically like assuming that I knew something and was saying like, I'm the father of the boy who died. Can you help me?
I see. Right. And that's the
Yeah.
father in the article.
That's the father in the article.
Right.
And so I guess, it's been a little while since I looked at this, so the names are escaping me right now. But I mean, the basic story is that, there was, I guess this was the beginning of November 2000, and must have been 2018 at this point, where there was a boat full of, a couple dozen Syrian refugees that tried to leave from a port north of Tripoli.
Yes.
And it capsized, and a young toddler drowned. So a very tragic story. And the father of the toddler reached out to me on WhatsApp, and initially I was like, who is this?
Sure.
Who is this person? How did they get my number? Are they even talking to the right person? Is this some kind of scam? Like, is this some kind of sick, dark scam?
Of course,
that somebody's calling themselves the father of the martyr, who's asking me for help with something? So I was, all like curious but skeptical, and I basically chatted with the guy for a little while, and ended up figuring out how he got my number. Which was, there are a number of different like Facebook groups and WhatsApp groups organized by Syrians, in Turkey, in Europe, all over the place, that monitored sea crossings. And I had been in touch with them for a different story I had done earlier. And so this father had contacted them afterwards, asking if they could help him somehow.
Right.
And they said, we can't help you, but here's the number of some journalists in Lebanon.
Wow.
Who we just talked to. So, it wasn't like I was like digging for days and days and days or weeks or months trying to uncover the story. It just sort of fell into my lap.
Right.
And it was a matter of, then it was just a matter of going and visiting him up in Tripoli, and talking to some other people up there to sort of build out the picture of what was happening.
But it's still, I mean, regardless of this, maybe how the story emerged, I think it's a very, there's a storytelling craft to that kind of reporting that I find very attractive. That I believe the toddler's name was Halted, if I'm not mistaken. But you bring them to life. This is not just a dry sort of statistics and sort of something that you kind of don't pay attention to. The figures that are continuous, the tragedy itself. I think you were able to kind of bring this person to life in a way, and especially to a Lebanese audience. I hope I'm getting this right. This was a story that was barely touched on, and I think yours is probably the most expansive take on it. And I'm just curious about you here, because I know that I've followed your work in different ways. I know that you used to work for Wired. I don't know if you still do. Maybe that's sort of I know your investigative journalism there, and I think that's primarily Africa-based, African sort of migrants heading north to Europe. But I never saw it in the Lebanese context, and I enjoyed it. And then I remembered over time that, no, you've done this before, just in different terrain, that you wrote a very attractive obituary of Anthony Bourdain. Now, these are very different, this is very different terrain. A tragedy north of Tripoli on a ship trying to make its way to Cyprus, and the suicide of Anthony Bourdain. They don't really link up naturally. But you've, I think, developed a storytelling craft that is so, really pulls the reader in, and it pulled me in. And I want to maybe leave the migration issue and just talk about storytelling altogether. What brought you to this world to begin with? And how is it that you can actually bring someone to life like Anthony Bourdain and bring his story to life, and also talk about the suffering of a migrant, the father losing his son at sea, and it's all Middle East focused. I'm just curious about you. What drew you to this world, and Why are you still involved in this world? And what is it about you that makes storytelling sort of part of your passion and your career?
Yeah.
Hint, hint. You should now introduce me to the podcast. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah. I mean,
I'm joking.
You're a big part of the story, Ronnie. Actually,
maybe I should edit the hint part out. I'll just sort of like fade to black.
Yeah.
Fade.
When coronavirus ends, take the Walk Beirut tour. Maybe you'll end up as lucky as me.
That's the plug I need when it comes back to life. Thank you. You did it for me.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question, and I did not find my way into it intentionally.
Mm-hmm.
I think is the best thing that I can say. I sort of stumbled into it, and in retrospect, it makes a lot of sense. But there was not a lot of foresight into the process of getting into it.
Right.
In terms of how I got into journalism, this is the story that you're a part of. Is
it's never been shared publicly. It's been shared between us, and now it's time.
Yeah, it's time. So I graduated from university in 2012, and had zero idea whatsoever what I wanted to do with my life. But I had studied international studies with a concentration in the Middle East, and I had to study Arabic for 3 years of that. It was
okay. So you kind of had an academic understanding, let's say, of what was happening.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, but academic, I think, is the key word.
Sure. Let's emphasize academic understanding.
Yeah. But I had to study Arabic for 3 years as part of that. And when I graduated, I mean, Arabic is a tough language for someone who's not a native speaker. And, we're 10 years past the point where I, decided to continue studying it after school, and I am still far from fluent in it. So, it was by far the most difficult thing that I did when I was in university.
Mm-hmm.
And literally the only thing that I could think to do as a way to put one foot in front of the other after I graduated was to say, this was the most difficult. I sort of asked myself this classic question of, where do I want to be 5 years after graduation?
Mm-hmm.
And I had no answer to it. The only answer that came to my mind was, Arabic was so difficult that if I don't do anything with this language at this point and forget everything that I've sort of learned up to this point, I'm just going to hate myself. So
that's interesting. So the language is kind of what drew you to the part of the world that speaks the language.
Yeah. And I don't know if it was so much of a romantic, Arabic is such a beautiful language, and I want to read Mahmoud Darwish in his native tongue and all of this kind of stuff, as it was I was just being stubborn. Just I put so much time into this.
Yeah.
That if I just leave it and forget everything now, I'm going to be really frustrated with myself. And I think I had also, from having an academic background in the Middle East, Beirut has a bit of an aura around it, right? So I had already...
So Beirut wasn't the first... It wasn't like you were thinking about Beirut while studying and then you thought, I would live in Lebanon. It didn't happen that way. It was more like a language that drew you to the Middle East over time, out of in a way, making sure your degree is worth something to you.
Yeah, it was like I want to continue to study Arabic because I would be really frustrated with myself if I forget everything, because I spent a lot of time studying flashcards.
But then what you did, and I like talking to you for a number of reasons, just not because we're friends, but also that I can do this with you without hesitation. You chose the worst country in the world to study Arabic.
I know. So this is where the aura of Beirut comes in,
yes.
right?
Yeah.
Because I had also sort of been, touched by the mythology of the city a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I knew very little about Lebanon. I moved there in October 2012. I knew very little about Lebanon before
Hmm.
I moved there.
Hmm.
Um, but I did, Beirut, like when people say Beirut, there's like there's a certain gravity to just the name of the city.
Yes.
So I was attracted to that without really knowing why I was attracted to it. So I was like, okay, I have no idea what I want to do with my life after graduation. I want to keep studying Arabic. Beirut sounds interesting. I don't really know why, but like there's this gravitational pull in that direction somehow. So let's put Arabic courses Beirut into Google and see what comes up.
Oh wow.
Um,
So
yeah.
that's
So
straightforward. That's how you ended up. Wow.
yeah, that's how I ended up in Beirut. And
Yes.
then a couple of weeks after I ended up in Beirut, I had a friend who was studying at LAU, who he was on an exchange program and was studying, Lebanese history, politics, and society. And I was, after I moved to Beirut, I was starting to educate myself a bit about, Lebanon and the history and everything.
Hmm.
Um, and he was like, "Hey, Eric, you should go take this walking tour." Um, and this is our friend Michael Coulomb. I feel like you probably remember Mike.
I
Or
mean, I do remember you with someone on the tour. It's probably him, or maybe not. Actually, my memory's not.
yeah, probably. I was thinking about this before. I've probably taken the tour more than I.
You.
I don't want to say more than anybody else, but like I have to be in the top 10 of like frequent tour
The
participants.
record holder, I think, has hit 10 times already. So you're definitely in the top three. I know that for sure.
Yeah, I have to be on like 6 or 7, and
Yeah.
if I haven't taken it 10 times, I've at least dropped people off there 10 times.
That's included, by the way. Those you get points for that too.
Oh, okay, so then I'm yeah, 10
Actually, you
easily.
get 2 points for that.
Oh, then yeah, I'm at
That's
like 25 or
because you
something.
showed up and brought someone with you, so that's technically,
Yeah,
you're at
thing
50.
is, great, top of the leaderboard.
Top, yeah, you won.
Um, so my friend Mike was studying at LAU, and I have to admit that first when he said take this walking tour, I was like, aren't walking like tours for these sort of like lame tourist things? Like, what am I actually gonna learn on a walking tour?
Absolutely.
Um, and and he said, look, I've been in Lebanon for 2 or 3 months studying history, politics, society, everything. I learned more in 3 hours on the Walk Beirut tour than I have learned in 3 months at LAU in my classes.
You're giving me too much plug. I need to. I will
This
use these for
this is
advertising later.
this is Mike. This isn't me.
Oh, so of course. Sorry. Well, then I need to do an episode with him.
Yeah, I'll give you his contact
Yes.
information after this. Um, and so I was still a little skeptical, but he said, "Okay, I'll stop hanging out with you unless you go on the tour." I didn't have too many friends in Lebanon at that point, so I was like,
Sure.
"Okay, fine, I'll go on the tour." Like, I guess if you're so
But
insistent.
you're still new to Beirut at that point. I mean, you had just
Yeah,
arrived, right?
I'd,
Yeah.
I'd been there for maybe a month or something like that.
Hmm.
Um, Long story short, somewhere along the line in the tour, we chatted a little bit. I told you I was in town studying Arabic, um, and you decided, you end the tour in Samir Asir Square,
Yes.
and decided to give me the task of reading the inscription on the bench. There's a
Right.
French inscription and an Arabic inscription on the bench, and somehow I mumbled my way through most of it and got the translation relatively like
I
75% accurate.
sometimes I have to do this on the podcast. Eric, can you read this?
Yeah. أعود إلى الشارع أحيا الرفاق تعود إلى gotta bring it out wadu.
But you already got what you needed out of it. So this is just for.
I'll send you my address so you can send me another copy of the book.
So that's in a way our friendship started from there.
It did. And also my journalism career started from there because the reward on the tour for reading that quote and translating it is being given a copy of Samir Asir's Beirut, a history.
Mm.
And I was standing around afterwards waiting to thank you for the tour and the book, and overheard you telling somebody else about the Samir Asir Foundation and that they sometimes take on interns.
Right.
Um, and so when I went home, I returned to my old friend Google and typed in Samir Asir Foundation. uh, and a couple weeks later ended up with an internship at the Sky Center for Media and Cultural Freedom, which is sort of what got me into the world of journalism and writing. Um,
I like that storytelling has this way of expanding, and it kind of links up because in a way I'm sharing a story about a journalist that I admired, a storyteller in all his right, and giving that sort of story to you, and then you finding your own story later and your own personal journey. This is quite meaningful to me. I mean, we joke around about it when we see each other in Beirut, and we've maybe we kind of, I mean, as friends would do, we kind of jibe at each other about it in different ways. And I think we've probably had more drinking nights together than flattery nights. And maybe one of your departure parties was at my apartment, maybe.
yeah, it was. It
Yeah.
was for sure.
From what I remember of that night, it ended up at my apartment. So that's, we've had those
Yeah,
moments
there was there
too.
was there was ping pong involved also.
Exactly, ping pong. Yes, thank you. But I like that you kind of. I mean, I associate a lot of what I read about Beirut today with people I know, and these are people I've met in the last few years, and you're one of them. And the obituary you wrote about Anthony Bourdain, in my opinion, still stands out. And I told you this in person after you wrote it. And the last lines of that piece, I'm going to share it here. In a way, then, Beirut gave us Bourdain, or at least helped unleash his voice that will now be so deeply missed. For that, we should all be thankful to this deeply troubled, yet somehow intensely beautiful city. I get from what you've written about Beirut and how you saw Anthony Bourdain's relationship to the city, and also how you saw Beirut's relationship to him, that you kind of are now part of that mix. That Beirut, in a way, impacted you to a point, and you've taken a lot of your own sort of trajectory from that city. And you end the piece with troubled, beautiful, and this sort of duality that we all know: prosperous, ruinous, stable, unstable, all of the above. But that duality, from your own perspective, asking you as a journalist and as someone who's lived in Lebanon, who I think probably still considers Beirut home. And if I got this right, I remember last time we spoke, you still only had an apartment you had a room for rent in Beirut that was technically your home still for the last number of years. So still you have some connection there. And I guess that it's permanent. The last few months of what we saw on the streets of Beirut, the demands that were not met, and the ability for protesters today to still push and demand that they're not going home. Do you see a time in your life, do you see a moment in your lifetime where Beirut will be able to end that cycle of trouble, despair, and beauty and prosperity, where we could only see a prosperous future rather than seeing the back and forth that we're all familiar with? Samir Asir wrote about it. I think it hit Anthony Bourdain hard. We've all lived through it in different ways. And I'm just curious, your own immediate reaction. Do you see hope on the horizon for Lebanon?
Um, yeah, I guess it's a tough question for me to answer. I mean, the easy answer is I hope so. Because as I think you were exactly right that I at least feel that Beirut has become part of my story, and in a lot of ways Beirut is also a city that in some ways is at least the story of it is defined by the people who have written about it. So every time I've written something about Beirut, I have been very, very conscious of sort of the tradition of writing about Beirut also that I am participating in. At the same time, it's a strange position to be in, that, just despite my last name looking deceptively like a Lebanese last name,
And
I have
sorry,
no,
you also could pass. You look more than I do at any point. You're more Lebanese than I am. So yeah, I'll give that one. Eric Reidy.
yeah, yeah. Um, so, but despite those things,
Mm-hmm.
I had no connection to the city until I was 22. Um, between 22 and, yeah, I lived there for the most part between the ages of 22 and 28.
Hmm.
And Beirut was home more than anywhere else in the world during that time period, and it still feels like it will always be home in a way. But I'm also, always an outsider in some way in the city. Like, I'm not,
Yeah. Yeah.
I, my relationship to it is as somebody who has come to it as a foreigner,
Mm-hmm.
and developed a relationship with it. But I'm not the, like, I'm not my fate isn't tied to it in the same way as
Yeah.
the fates of the protesters on the street. So I feel like I can't claim belonging in the same way. It's a voluntary relationship as opposed to,
Yeah.
a relationship of birth.
But even then,
Um,
even at that kind of healthy distance to the story, you still see some hope on the horizon.
yeah, I think I have, from the time I started living there, I have been hopeful to some degree because of the people I know in the city,
Mm.
uh,
Mm-hmm.
you know, who care about the place, who believe in what it can be, what it could be, who are, you know, carrying on this tradition of, that writers like Samir Asir believed in and
Mm.
were working towards. Your tour is part of that, and I'm not saying that to, be
To get
complimentary.
more points.
Yeah, to inch up on the leaderboard. No, I mean it sincerely. Your tour is, in terms of storytelling, is a part of telling that story about, the pain and the struggle and the beauty and what this place could be. And the people at the Samir Asir Foundation and the Sky Center for Media and Cultural Freedom, which has been a big part of my experience with Lebanon. Also, these are people who, believe in the symbol of what Lebanon could be in its most, in its best version of itself, not
Right.
the version
Right.
of itself that it is right now,
Right.
but the version of itself that it could be. And so, and I think in a lot of ways, the protests that have been happening since October are an expression of this same tradition.
Hmm. Hmm.
And, not exclusively. I think it's probably too simplistic to paint them with one
Mm-hmm.
brush, but, at least that tradition is being expressed in aspects of the protests and in a lot of people who are involved in them. This idea of what this country could be as the best version of itself.
Yeah.
And so, I guess as long as those people are around who are willing to work towards that and fight for that, then I am hopeful to some extent. Do I have a prediction about whether it will be in my lifetime or, something like that? I hope so. I guess I also, think about history not so much as, as a linear progression, but
Yeah.
as a lot of different fits and starts.
Right.
So,
Right.
I think about Beirut often. Even not living there anymore. It's been almost a year since I last visited. But in my head during lockdown, I sometimes walk down the streets that are so familiar to me and imagine what they look like, you know, both gutted by the economic situation and now also gutted by the, the coronavirus situation. And just sort of, try to imagine, what these months and what this time is doing to this city that has always been so vivacious in so many ways. And it saddens me to think about what they probably are like, and to see the glimpses of them that I do through friends and that kind of stuff.
Eric, that was both sober and sweet. And I think even if your life was even if you only spent 6 years, that's still a 6 years that I think probably changed you from within. And I'm glad that I played a small part in your storytelling evolution. I won't take any credit beyond that. Just that you accidentally Google searched a few things and then accidentally ended up on a tour and accidentally landed in an internship that accidentally took you into the journalism career. I'm happy that I stumbled into you in that way, and that we've sort of kept our conversations going since. And I know I know you don't have any personal stake like the protester on the street, but I know that Beirut impacted your life personally. And I also know that, and I hope I can keep this in the episode, you, at some point, you fell in love with a woman. I believe you're at her place right now. And you told me something in passing, which I loved. You said, yeah, I really want her to visit Beirut. I want her to know what home feels like. And I'm like, you're not from... Like, you don't want to take her back to the States. You want to take her to Beirut. And I love that. Yeah. The initial place you wanted her to see is your life in Lebanon, which I think that sort of speaks for itself. And
absolutely.
And Eric, all the uncensored stuff will stay between us. There's a lot of good stuff that will not make it to the episode. I appreciate the fact that you're still doing storytelling, even if it's not in Lebanon, even if you're not there for the time being. You're in Mumbai at the moment. I'm in New York. I look forward to running into you in Beirut, and I think that will happen sooner than later. So with that,
we can have a meal at Charlevil's and find a cafe on the steps to play a game of chess.
That's the episode that will never happen. My conversation with Sherbil, because I think it'll just be maybe 5 seconds of a thought that just kind of derails into something else that's just menu oriented and shouting. I don't know what to do, but he is part of our life, and I think I've enjoyed just sending photos of him at Le Chef while I'm eating, and then you kind of walk in, or you are literally on your way there,
walking past the window,
and we ended up eating together many, many times. I think we'll do that sooner than later. So I've taken too much of your time. It's probably past 1 on your side. So Eric, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ronnie.
Thanks for listening, and a friendly reminder to help support this podcast by contributing through Patreon or PayPal. All links are in the details box below. Until next time, I'm Ronnie Shatah, and this is the Beirut Banyan.